Welcome to The Invisible Advantage. I'm Stephen, and I'm joined by my co-host Edith. This podcast exists to reveal something fascinating yet troubling, the subtle, often invisible differences in mindset, upbringing, and worldview between children of wealthy and middle-class families. More importantly, we're here to make these advantages teachable and actionable, regardless of your background. We want to uncover the hidden psychological frameworks that create lasting advantage, learn the unwritten rules of success, and give you practical tools to cultivate these advantages.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something that might surprise you. Picture this split-screen scenario. Two equally bright teenagers are discussing their futures. One says, "I want to be a doctor, or maybe a teacher, something stable." The other says, "I'm thinking about starting a biotech company, or maybe becoming a Supreme Court justice." What creates this fundamental difference in scope? What allows one child to dream so expansively while another instinctively limits their possibilities?
That's the heart of today's episode, the safety net and the permission to dream big. We'll explore how financial and emotional security creates psychological permission for risk-taking and expansive thinking. We're going to unpack four core concepts: the of course factor versus be realistic conditioning, safety net psychology and how backup plans enable bold primary plans, the critical difference between viewing failure as information versus failure as proof of limits, and finally, the expansion versus contraction mindset.
These concepts are foundational because they shape everything that comes after: career choices, relationship patterns, even how someone approaches daily challenges. Think of this as the psychological architecture that either supports or constrains a person's entire life trajectory.
Let's start with what I call the of course factor. In wealthy families, there's often an unspoken assumption that the child will, of course, attend college, of course have meaningful career options, of course be able to take risks because there's always a fallback. Compare this to middle-class families where the conditioning is often be realistic, don't aim too high, don't take unnecessary risks, focus on security first.
This is where the invisible advantage becomes crystal clear. It's not just about having money, it's about having permission. Imagine two children learning to swim. One child has a swimming instructor, flotation devices, and parents cheering from the poolside knowing there's a lifeguard on duty. The other child is learning in a lake with their parents saying, "Don't go too deep, stay where you can touch the bottom." Both children might become swimmers, but their relationship with water, with risk, will be fundamentally different.
That's a perfect analogy because it captures how safety net psychology works. When you know you have reliable backup plans, your primary plans can be exponentially bolder. A child from a wealthy family might think, "I'll start this tech company, and if it fails, I can always go to law school. Dad's connections will help me get in, and worst case, I move back home while I figure it out." Meanwhile, a middle-class child thinks, "I better choose something stable because I can't afford to fail."
And here's where it gets really interesting. This isn't just about financial safety nets. Wealthy families often provide multiple types of backup systems. There's the network safety net, knowing that family friends can provide internships or job recommendations. There's the knowledge safety net, having parents who understand how elite institutions work. There's even the time safety net, not needing to work during college or take on debt that requires immediate post-graduation income.
This creates what researchers call an internal locus of control, the belief that you can influence outcomes through your actions. When you've grown up with multiple safety nets, you develop confidence that you can navigate challenges successfully. Contrast this with external locus of control, where you believe outcomes are largely determined by luck or forces beyond your control.
Let me paint this picture more vividly. Imagine family dinner conversations. In one household, a teenager mentions wanting to study art history. The response might be, "That's wonderful. You could curate exhibitions, work in museums, or even start an art consulting business. Your aunt knows several gallery owners in New York." In another household, the same interest might be met with, "Art history? How will you make a living? You need something practical. What about accounting or nursing?"
Both responses come from love, but they create entirely different psychological landscapes. The first response expands possibilities, while the second contracts them. Over time, these patterns become internalized. The child who hears expansion messages develops what we might call an abundance mindset. There are multiple paths to success, opportunities are plenty, and challenges are solvable. The child who hears contraction messages develops a scarcity mindset. Opportunities are limited, you must choose carefully, and mistakes are dangerous.
This brings us to one of the most crucial differences: how failure is interpreted. Let's consider two teenagers who both start summer projects that fail. The first teenager tries to create a small online business selling handmade jewelry. After 3 months, she's barely broken even and decides to shut it down. Her parents' response? What an incredible learning experience. You learned about marketing, customer service, and managing finances. What did you discover that you want to apply to your next venture?
Meanwhile, the second teenager has the same experience but gets a different response. We told you this was risky. You should have focused on your summer job at the grocery store instead. This is exactly why we need to stick to practical choices. Same outcome, completely different meaning assigned to the experience.
In the wealthy family's response, failure becomes information, data to inform better future decisions. In the middle-class family's response, failure becomes proof of personal limits or confirmation that risk-taking was inappropriate. This difference shapes everything, whether someone will start a business, change careers, negotiate for better opportunities, or even end unsatisfying relationships.
This is what we call the architecture of confidence. Consistent stability doesn't just provide material resources, it fosters a fundamental belief that you can influence outcomes. When you've experienced reliable safety nets, you develop what psychologists call generalized trust. Trust that systems will work, that people will help, that problems can be solved.
Think of confidence like a muscle. Wealthy children get to exercise this muscle regularly in low-stakes environments. They might negotiate with parents about curfew, advocate for themselves with teachers, or start clubs at school, all while knowing that mistakes won't have devastating consequences. They're building confidence through practice, with safety nets in place.
Meanwhile, middle-class children often have fewer opportunities for this kind of low-risk confidence building. They might be discouraged from negotiating or advocating for themselves because the family can't afford potential negative consequences. Don't rock the boat becomes internalized wisdom even when boat rocking would be advantageous.
This creates what we call the expansion versus contraction mindset. The expansion mindset asks, what's possible? The contraction mindset asks, what's safe? Both are rational responses to different circumstances, but they produce dramatically different life trajectories.
Now, here's the crucial point, and why we're having this conversation. These patterns aren't permanent or unchangeable. They're learned responses that can be unlearned and replaced. The invisible advantages of wealth aren't actually invisible once you know what to look for, and they're not exclusively tied to money.
Exactly. Let's talk about practical applications. First, conduct what we call a safety net audit. Even without financial wealth, what non-monetary safety nets can you provide? This might include offering your time and mentorship, sharing your professional network, providing housing during transitions, or simply guaranteeing emotional support through failures.
Second, implement controlled risk allowance. Give children small projects with agreed-upon failure recovery rules. Maybe they can start a small business with a $50 budget, knowing that if it fails, the loss is acceptable and the learning experience is valued. The key is created environments where failure is safe and information-rich.
Third, practice what we call possibility language. Start noticing and replacing limiting phrases. Instead of, we can't afford that, try, we choose to prioritize other things right now. Instead of, that's not realistic, try, that would require some creative planning. The goal isn't to be dishonest about constraints, but to model thinking that focuses on possibilities rather than limitations.
These language shifts are more powerful than they might initially seem. Children are constantly absorbing messages about what's possible or impossible, appropriate or inappropriate. By consciously choosing expansion language, you're literally rewiring their sense of what's achievable.
And here's something fascinating that we'll explore in future episodes. This isn't just about individual psychology. These mindset patterns affect how someone navigates social situations, professional networks, and even romantic relationships. The person who learned to think expansively approaches a job interview differently than someone who learned to think contractively.
Which brings us to our key insight for today. The most successful people weren't necessarily the smartest. They were the ones who never learned certain things were impossible. Risk tolerance isn't primarily about courage, It's about having believable backup plans. When you truly believe that failure won't destroy you, you can pursue opportunities that others consider too dangerous.
This reframes everything, doesn't it? We often think of successful risk takers as naturally brave, but they might simply be people who grew up with such robust safety nets that what looks like courage to others feels like reasonable, calculated risk to them.
And that's exactly the kind of invisible advantage we're here to reveal and democratize. In our next episode, we'll explore how these foundational mindsets translate into specific social skills, particularly the art of assumption making, and how wealthy children learn to operate as if they belong everywhere, while middle-class children often learn to wait for permission or invitation.
Until then, I encourage listeners to observe the language patterns in their own families and communities. Notice whether conversations tend toward expansion or contraction, whether failure is treated as information or limitation, and whether children are being given safe spaces to build confidence through low-stakes risk-taking.
Remember, recognizing these patterns is the first step toward changing them. The invisible advantages of wealth become visible when you know what to look for, and many of them can be cultivated regardless of your bank account.
Thanks for joining us on The Invisible Advantage. We'll see you next time.
Welcome back to The Invisible Advantage, where we decode the subtle patterns that separate those who thrive from those who merely survive. I'm Stephen, and I'm here with my co-host Edith to explore the hidden architectures of success.
Thanks for joining us. In our last episode, we examined how the safety net of financial and emotional security creates psychological permission for bold thinking. Today, we're diving into something equally powerful but far more invisible: social capital as infrastructure.
Picture this scenario. Two equally qualified people apply for their dream jobs. One sends a polished, cold application through the company website. The other mentions casually that they heard about the opening through a college roommate's father who once worked with the hiring manager. Neither candidate is using unfair advantages or calling in favors. So why does one approach feel so fundamentally different from the other?
That's the mystery we're unraveling today. We're going to explore social capital as a family asset, understand the power of weak ties, examine what I call the matchmaking mindset, and distinguish between relationship infrastructure and transactional networking. These concepts build directly on our previous discussion about safety nets, because networks themselves become a form of security that enables even bolder risk-taking.
The foundation here is understanding that wealthy families don't just accumulate financial wealth. They systematically build and pass down social capital like any other generational asset. This isn't about old boys clubs or exclusive country club memberships. It's about viewing human connections as infrastructure that requires intentional construction and maintenance.
Exactly. Think of social capital as the roads, bridges, and communication networks of human potential. Most families treat relationships as accidents. You meet people randomly and hope for the best. But affluent families approach this with the same strategic thinking they'd apply to investment portfolios. They're not just collecting business cards, they're building a living ecosystem of mutual value creation.
This brings us to what sociologists call weak ties theory, which reveals something counterintuitive about how opportunities actually flow through society. Mark Granovetter's research showed that most people find jobs through acquaintances, not close friends. The person who changes your life is rarely your best friend. It's often someone you know casually who happens to know someone else who knows about an opening you'd never hear about otherwise.
I love this concept because it completely reframes networking. Imagine your close relationships as a pond and your weak ties as rivers. The pond is deep and meaningful, but the rivers connect you to entirely different lakes you could never reach otherwise. Wealthy children grow up understanding that every interaction is potentially a bridge to an unknown destination.
What's fascinating is how this manifests in daily family life. When affluent parents plan social gatherings, they're often thinking several moves ahead. They're not just inviting people they enjoy, they're creating environments where their children can naturally interact with adults from different industries, different perspectives, different capabilities.
This is what I call the matchmaking mindset, but not in a romantic sense. These parents are constantly making mental connections. Sarah's daughter is interested in marine biology, and Tom's colleague runs an ocean research lab. I should introduce them. They're playing a long-term game of human chess, positioning pieces for future possibilities their children can't even envision yet.
The footwork here is crucial. These introductions happen before the child knows they need them. A 12-year-old meeting a documentary filmmaker doesn't realize that conversation might influence their career 8 years later. But the parent is creating what we might call dormant ties, relationships that lie quiet until the right moment activates them.
Compare this to the typical middle-class approach, which tends to be reactive. Parents focus on immediate needs. My teenager needs a summer job, so now I'm frantically asking around. By then, you're competing in a crowded marketplace rather than accessing opportunities through relationship channels that were built over years.
This connects to another invisible advantage: how affluent children learn to interact with influential adults as peers rather than superiors. They're regularly exposed to dinner table conversations where adults are discussed by first names, where industries and achievements are discussed casually, where power structures become familiar rather than intimidating.
Think about the confidence this builds. When a 22-year-old meets a CEO, they're not starstruck because they've been around successful adults their entire lives. They know these are just people with interesting jobs and specific expertise. That comfort level translates into more natural, memorable conversations that often lead to mentorship or opportunity.
But here's what separates relationship infrastructure from transactional networking: the focus on adding value first. Sophisticated networkers understand that relationships are built on mutual benefit, not one-sided extraction. They teach their children to think constantly about what they can offer others, not just what they might receive.
This creates a beautiful paradox. The people who are best at getting help are often the ones who focus least on getting help. They're so busy offering value, making connections for others, and contributing to their communities that opportunities naturally flow toward them. It's like being the person who's always introducing others at a party. Eventually, everyone wants to introduce opportunities to you.
Let's examine this through a concrete scenario. Imagine two teenagers interested in environmental policy. The first waits for summer internship applications to open, then competes with hundreds of other applicants for a few positions. The second mentions their interest to their parents, who remember that their neighbor's sister works at an environmental think tank. A casual introduction leads to an informal coffee meeting, which leads to shadowing opportunity, which leads to a proper internship created specifically for this teenager.
Notice what happened there. The second teenager didn't skip any steps or receive unfair advantages. They still had to demonstrate competence, passion, and professionalism, but they accessed a different channel entirely, one that bypassed the formal competition and created a personalized pathway to the same destination.
This is the network effect in action. Each connection multiplies the possibility space. If you know 100 people and each of them knows 100 people you don't, you have indirect access to 10,000 individuals. But if those connections aren't activated through introductions and maintained through value exchange, they remain theoretical.
The infrastructure metaphor is perfect here. Just like physical infrastructure, social capital requires maintenance. Successful families don't just make connections, they nurture them through regular but not burdensome contact. Holiday cards, congratulations on achievements, sharing relevant articles, making introductions between their contacts. They're constantly adding small deposits to relationship accounts.
This maintenance creates what I think of as relationship momentum. When you need to reach out for something important, it doesn't feel cold or awkward because there's been ongoing connection. The conversation flows naturally from previous interactions rather than starting from zero.
But perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this approach is how it compounds across generations. When a 45-year-old professional makes a connection, they're not just thinking about their own opportunities. They're building assets their children might leverage 20 years later. That documentary filmmaker they met at a conference might become the person who gives their daughter her first break in media.
This long-term thinking is enabled by the same safety net psychology we discussed in our previous episode. When you're not desperately seeking immediate solutions to survival problems, you can invest in relationships that might pay dividends far in the future. Scarcity mindset focuses on extracting value quickly. Abundance mindset focuses on creating value consistently over time.
What makes this particularly powerful is how it becomes self-reinforcing. Children who grow up in relationship-rich environments naturally develop better social skills, more sophisticated understanding of different industries and perspectives, and greater comfort with ambiguity and opportunity. They become the kind of people others want to help, creating an upward spiral of connection and possibility.
The practical applications here are transformative for any family willing to think strategically. Start with what I call a family people map. Literally list 15 people you could introduce your child to. Then commit to making one introduction this week. Not for any specific purpose, just to expand their universe of possibility.
Help your child develop what I call their value proposition, a clear, authentic 30-second explanation of what they're passionate about and what unique perspective or skill they bring. This isn't about bragging. It's about making it easy for others to remember them and think of opportunities that might align with their interests.
And consider hosting what I call a low-cost salon, a gathering of just 3 families with complementary skills or interests. Let the children present projects to a small audience of engaged adults. You're creating the same dynamic that happens naturally in affluent circles, but with intentionality rather than accident.
The beautiful thing about social capital is that it's not zero-sum. When you help someone make a connection, you haven't lost anything. You've actually strengthened your position in both networks. Every introduction you facilitate makes you more valuable to future connections.
This brings us to today's key insight. Your network isn't fundamentally about who can help you, it's about who you can help. The first approach creates temporary transactions. The second creates permanent infrastructure. When you become known as someone who connects people and creates value for others, opportunities begin seeking you out rather than requiring you to chase them.
Next time, we're going to explore how this network effect intersects with what I call cultural fluency, the invisible language that determines who gets taken seriously in different environments. We'll examine how wealthy families teach their children to code switch effortlessly between different social contexts, and why this skill often matters more than technical competence.
Until then, remember that opportunity often arrives as an introduction, not an application. Start building those bridges today and watch how your family's universe of possibility begins to expand.
Thanks for listening to The Invisible Advantage. We're Stephen and Edith, and we'll see you next time.
Welcome back to The Invisible Advantage. I'm Stephen, and joining me as always is Edith. Today we're diving into something that might sound familiar, but operates at a level most people never see: the ownership mindset. Here's a scenario that'll set the stage. Picture 2 employees, equally talented, equally committed to their company's success. A problem emerges. Maybe a system crashes, a client complains, or a process breaks down. Employee A immediately thinks, "That's not my department, someone else needs to handle this." Employee B looks at the same situation and thinks, "How can I solve this and create value?" Both people care about their jobs equally, but something fundamentally different is happening in their minds. What creates this difference?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that reveals something profound about how different families, particularly wealthy versus middle-class families, shape their children's relationship to problems and challenges. Today, we're exploring the ownership mindset, systems thinking, and how problems can become assets rather than obstacles. We'll examine the language patterns that reveal these different approaches, the strategic thinking that focuses on leverage rather than just effort, and most importantly, how any family can cultivate these advantages.
Before we dive in, let's acknowledge how this builds on our previous episode about social capital and networking. We discussed how wealthy families view relationships as infrastructure, permanent assets that create opportunities over time. The ownership mindset takes this further. It's not just about who you know, it's about how you think when challenges arise. It's the difference between waiting for someone to solve problems for you versus positioning yourself as the person who makes problems disappear for others.
Exactly, and this connects directly to why some people become indispensable while others remain replaceable, regardless of their technical skills. The ownership mindset isn't about working harder, it's about thinking differently about what work actually is.
So let's start with the foundational concept: problems as assets. This might sound counterintuitive to many listeners. How do wealthy families teach their children to see challenges as opportunities rather than threats?
It begins with a fundamental reframe that happens early and consistently in affluent households. When a problem arises, let's say a child comes home complaining about a difficult teacher or a broken system at school, the family's response isn't, "That's terrible, how unfair," or "There's nothing you can do about that." Instead, the conversation immediately shifts to, what's the opportunity here? Or how might you add value to this situation?
That's a profound shift in language patterns, which brings us to our second core concept. The difference between "how can I" versus "that's not my job" represents entirely different mental operating systems.
Think of it this way: language is like a mental GPS. It doesn't just describe where you are, it determines where you go next. "That's not my job" is a destination limiting phrase. It says, my responsibility ends here and my growth stops at these boundaries. But "how can I" is an expansion phrase. It asks, where can I create value that others don't see yet?
And this connects to systems thinking, doesn't it? The third core concept we need to explore. Wealthy families tend to teach their children to see how individual actions ripple through larger systems.
Absolutely. Let me paint you a picture. Imagine a family dinner where a teenager mentions that her school's fundraiser is struggling because the online donation system keeps crashing. In many households, this becomes a complaint session about incompetent administrators. But in families with an ownership mindset, this becomes a case study. The parent might ask, who loses when the system doesn't work? What would happen if you figured out how to fix it? What skills would you need? Who could you talk to? How might solving this create value for you beyond just helping the school?
That's remarkable because it transforms a frustrating situation into what we might call an opportunity mapping exercise. The child learns to see problems not as evidence that systems are broken, but evidence of where value can be created.
Exactly. And this leads us to our fourth core concept, the difference between creating value and consuming value. Most people are taught to be good consumers, follow instructions, complete assignments, meet requirements. But families with generational wealth teach their children to be value creators, to ask what they can add to every situation they enter.
Now, let's get practical with our deep dive into what you've called the calculus of risk and ownership. How do secure families teach their children to view failure differently?
This is where the safety net creates a completely different learning environment. When basic security isn't a concern, failure becomes data collection rather than evidence of limits. Let me give you a concrete example. Two teenagers both fail to get into their first-choice college. The middle-class family might focus on what went wrong, what limitations were revealed, how to avoid similar failures. The wealthy family treats this as market research. What does this tell us about positioning? What skills need developed? Which relationships should we activate? How do we turn this information into competitive advantage?
That's a fundamental difference in how risk is calculated. The secure family can afford to let their child experiment because the downside is limited and temporary, while the upside could be transformational.
Right, and this safety creates space for strategic thinking rather than just hard work. Most people are taught that effort equals results. Work harder, get better outcomes. But wealthy families teach leverage thinking. They ask, how can we work smarter? What systems can we build? How can we position ourselves so that opportunities come to us? Where can we add value that makes us indispensable?
I want to share a vignette that illustrates this perfectly. Picture a family meeting where a high school student is struggling with a group project. 3 teammates aren't contributing, deadlines are being missed, and the grade is in jeopardy. How might this conversation unfold differently in families with different mindsets?
In the scarcity-focused household, the conversation centers on fairness and protection. This isn't fair to you. Talk to the teacher. Document what you've done. Make sure you don't get blamed for their mistakes. The goal is damage control.
But in the ownership-minded family?
The questions are completely different. What would you do if this were your company and these were your employees? How could you motivate the team? What systems could you create to ensure quality work? How might you turn this challenge into an opportunity to demonstrate leadership? What could you learn about project management that would serve you for life?
The student with the first approach learns to protect themselves from unfair situations. The student with the second approach learns to transform unfair situations into competitive advantages.
And here's what's fascinating. Both approaches might result in the same grade on that particular project, but they create entirely different skill sets and mental models for how to approach challenges throughout life.
This brings us to the practical applications, because the question our listeners are asking is, how do we implement these concepts regardless of our current economic situation? Let's start with the ownership language swap.
This is deceptively simple but profoundly powerful. For 1 week, every time you or your family members catch yourselves using victim language, I can't, they won't let me, that's not fair, it's not my fault, you replace it with agency language. How can I? What would I do if this were mine? Where's the opportunity here? What can I control?
It's like installing new mental software. The language literally rewires how you process challenges.
The second practical application is the weekly problem to opportunity practice. Every week, the family identifies one current problem and spends 15 minutes brainstorming how it could become an advantage. Maybe it's a neighbor's barking dog, a broken appliance, a difficult teacher, or a workplace conflict. The goal isn't necessarily to solve everything, but to train the mind to automatically look for value creation opportunities within challenges.
And the third application might be the most powerful, the "what would I do if this were mine" exercise. This applies ownership thinking to situations where you don't technically have ownership.
Right. Whether it's a part-time job, a school club, a volunteer position, or even just being a customer at a business, you ask, if I owned this, what would I do differently? How would I improve systems? What value could I add? How would I solve the problems I'm observing? This mental exercise develops the thinking patterns that make people naturally rise to leadership positions.
What I find remarkable about these applications is that they don't require money, connections, or special resources. They're purely mental models that anyone can adopt.
That's the beautiful irony of the invisible advantage. Many of these patterns became associated with wealth not because money creates them, but because financial security creates the safety to develop them. But once you understand the patterns, you can cultivate them regardless of your economic starting point.
Let's talk about why this matters beyond individual success. How does the ownership mindset affect entire organizations and communities?
Think about it this way. Every organization, every community, every family is constantly generating problems. That's just the nature of complex systems. The question is, who steps forward to solve them? In most groups, there are far more problem identifiers than problem solvers. The people who consistently ask, how can I help solve this, rather than who's responsible for fixing this, become the people everyone depends on.
And that dependence becomes influence, which becomes opportunity, which becomes advancement.
Exactly. But here's what's crucial to understand. This isn't about taking advantage of others or manipulating situations. Genuine ownership thinking actually creates value for everyone. When someone approaches a problem thinking, how can I make this better, they often discover solutions that benefit the entire system.
This connects to something we discussed in our networking episode, the difference between transactional and relational approaches. The ownership mindset is inherently relational because it focuses on creating value for others.
That's a brilliant connection. Just as we discussed how your network should be about who you can help rather than who can help you, the ownership mindset asks, how can I make everyone's job easier rather than how can I protect my position?
As we wrap up today's discussion, what's the key insight you want listeners to remember?
The people who get promoted, who get opportunities, who become indispensable, aren't necessarily those who do their jobs best. They're the ones who make everyone else's job easier. Ownership thinking is the difference between employment and leadership, between following instructions and shaping outcomes.
And the beautiful thing is that this shift can begin immediately. You don't need to wait for permission or perfect conditions. Every problem you encounter today is a potential opportunity to practice ownership thinking.
Next time, we'll explore how wealthy families think about time itself, not just as a resource to manage, but as an asset to leverage. We'll discuss the concept of time arbitrage and how some families teach their children to think in decades rather than semesters.
Until then, remember that the invisible advantages aren't really invisible once you know where to look. They're patterns of thinking that anyone can adopt, starting right now. Welcome back to The Invisible Advantage. I'm Steven, and today we're diving into something that sounds almost counterintuitive in our achievement-obsessed culture. Picture this. Two families, both deeply committed to their children's success. One child races from violin lessons to math tutoring to soccer practice, their calendar packed with enriching activities. The other child has what looks like empty time, afternoons with no scheduled programming, hours to wander and wonder. Both parents are investing heavily in their child's future, but they're creating fundamentally different capabilities. What's happening here?
That's such a compelling image, and I'm Edith. What you're describing gets to the heart of how wealthy families think about time itself as a strategic resource. We've talked about ownership mindset, about seeing problems as opportunities rather than obstacles, but none of that develops without what I call time wealth, the luxury of unscheduled space where children can follow their curiosity, develop autonomy, and learn to direct their own attention.
Time wealth versus time poverty. That's a fascinating framework because when we look at middle-class families, there's often this sense that every moment needs to be optimized, every hour filled with something that builds toward college applications or career preparation. But you're suggesting that this well-intentioned approach might actually be counterproductive.
Exactly. Think about it this way. When a child's day is entirely structured by external authorities, parents, teachers, coaches, they never develop the muscle of self-direction. They become incredibly good at following instructions, at moving efficiently between predetermined activities, but they never learn to generate their own projects, to sit with uncertainty, or to follow a thread of interest wherever it might lead.
This connects directly to what we discussed about ownership thinking. If children never experience unstructured time where they have to figure out what to do with themselves, how can they develop that fundamental sense of agency? They're always responding to someone else's agenda rather than creating their own.
Right, and here's where it gets really interesting. Wealthy families understand something counterintuitive about boredom. In most middle-class contexts, boredom is seen as a problem to be solved. If a child says they're bored, the immediate response is to find them an activity, suggest something productive, fill that gap. But families with time wealth treat boredom as valuable information. It's the starting point for creativity, the space where genuine interests emerge.
So boredom becomes a creativity catalyst rather than a problem to eliminate. That's a profound shift in perspective. Can you walk us through how this actually plays out in practice?
Imagine two 10-year-olds on a Saturday afternoon. Child A has piano practice at 1 p.m., then soccer at 3 p.m., then family time with educational board games. Their day is optimized for skill building and family connection. Child B has been told, "You have the afternoon to yourself, dinner's at 6. Initially, Child B might complain about being bored, but that boredom forces them to scan their internal landscape. What am I actually curious about right now? Maybe they start sketching, then become fascinated with perspective and shadows. 3 hours later, they've taught themselves something about light and form that no structured art class could have provided.
The key difference being that Child B had to generate their own motivation, their own learning objectives. They had to become the architect of their own experience rather than just the executor of someone else's plan.
Exactly. And this is where we see autonomy leading to ownership. When children regularly experience unstructured time and learn to navigate it successfully, they develop what psychologists call intrinsic motivation. They discover that satisfaction comes not from external validation or completing predetermined tasks, but from pursuing something because it genuinely interests them.
This reminds me of what researchers call the difference between shallow enrichment and deep work. You can expose a child to dozens of activities, giving them a broad sampling of skills and experiences, but without the time and space to go deep into something they've chosen themselves, they never develop that capacity for sustained, focused attention that really distinguishes high performers.
That's such an important distinction. Shallow enrichment is like being a tourist in many different countries. You get exposure, you collect experiences, but you never really understand how any particular place works. Deep work is like becoming a temporary resident somewhere, learning the language, understanding the rhythms and patterns that aren't visible to casual observers.
And wealthy families seem to instinctively understand that deep competence in one area is more valuable than surface-level familiarity with many areas. But this requires something that feels risky to many parents, the willingness to let their children potentially waste time, to follow interests that might not lead anywhere productive.
This brings us to what I call the deliberate parent paradox. Upper-income parents often have very high expectations for their children. They're not permissive or hands-off, but they balance those high expectations with exploration time. They're strategic about when to direct and when to step back.
So it's not about being less involved or having lower standards. It's about understanding when involvement helps and when it hinders the development of self-direction.
Precisely. Let me give you a concrete example. I know a family where their 12-year-old became fascinated with medieval history after reading a fantasy novel. Instead of immediately signing him up for a history enrichment program or buying him educational documentaries, his parents created space for this interest to develop organically. They cleared his schedule 2 afternoons a week, gave him access to library books and online resources, and basically said, "Follow this wherever it leads."
What happened?
Over 6 months, this child taught himself basic Latin because he wanted to read primary sources. He learned about agricultural systems, political structures, art history, all because he was allowed to follow his genuine curiosity. He started creating detailed maps and timelines, not because anyone assigned them, but because that's how his mind wanted to organize the information. By the end of the year, his understanding of medieval Europe was probably deeper than many high school students who'd taken a formal course.
And crucially, he developed the experience of sustained, self-directed learning. He learned that he could pursue complex questions on his own, that he could become genuinely expert in something through his own initiative.
Right, and compare that to a more typical approach where parents might have enrolled him in a medieval history class, bought him age-appropriate books about knights and castles, and checked his progress weekly. He might have learned some interesting facts, but he wouldn't have developed that fundamental capacity for intellectual autonomy.
This connects to something we've touched on in previous episodes, the difference between creating value and just consuming it. When children have unstructured time to pursue their own projects, they naturally move from being consumers of information to creators of their own understanding.
That's beautifully put. And here's where the time wealth concept becomes really strategic. Wealthy families understand that in our increasingly complex economy, the ability to teach yourself, to identify problems worth solving, and to sustain attention on difficult questions, these are the meta skills that matter most. You can't develop those skills by being constantly directed by others.
So when we talk about concerted cultivation versus overscheduling, we're really talking about the difference between strategic and reactive parenting. Strategic parents are thinking about what capacities they want their children to develop. Reactive parents are responding to cultural pressure to keep children busy and stimulated.
Exactly. And this is where many well-meaning parents get trapped. They see other families with packed schedules and worry that their children are falling behind if they're not equally busy. But they're optimizing for the wrong metrics. They're measuring inputs, how many activities, how many hours of instruction, rather than outputs like curiosity, persistence, or self-direction.
Let's talk about how this plays out in practical terms. For families who recognize the value of time wealth but feel anxious about implementing it, what does this actually look like day to day?
Start small and be intentional about it. Instead of trying to revolutionize your family's entire schedule, begin with what I call project incubator time. 3 times a week for 45 to 60 minutes, create space for completely child-led exploration. No suggestions from parents, no educational objectives, just protected time for following curiosity.
And what about the inevitable "I'm bored" complaints?
Embrace them. When a child says they're bored, resist the impulse to solve that problem for them. Instead, treat it as valuable information. You might say something like, "That's interesting. What does boredom feel like in your body? What thoughts come up when you sit with that feeling?" Help them understand that boredom is often the beginning of creativity, not the absence of it.
That's a profound reframe. Instead of treating boredom as a problem to be eliminated, you're teaching children to see it as a signal that their minds are ready to generate something new.
Right, and over time, children learn to navigate these unstructured periods more skillfully. They develop what you might call boredom tolerance, the ability to sit with uncertainty and not immediately reach for external stimulation. This is an incredibly valuable capacity in our distraction-rich world.
For families who are concerned about falling behind academically or missing out on important skill development, how do you address those legitimate concerns while still prioritizing exploration time?
This is where the activity trade concept becomes really useful. Instead of adding exploration time on top of an already packed schedule, deliberately replace one structured activity with unstructured time. Maybe your child drops one of their 3 sports to have more time for self-directed projects. You're not reducing their overall development, you're just shifting some of it from external direction to internal motivation.
And the research suggests that children who develop strong self-direction and intrinsic motivation often outperform their more heavily scheduled peers in the long run, even if they might seem less accomplished in the short term.
Absolutely, because here's what many parents don't realize. The goal isn't to fill time optimally. The goal is to teach children to use time strategically. And you can't learn to use time strategically if you never actually control your own time.
This reminds me of the distinction between efficiency and effectiveness. A packed schedule might be very efficient, every moment is productive, but it might not be effective at developing the capacities that actually matter most for long-term success and satisfaction.
That's such an important point. When we optimize for efficiency, we often sacrifice the deeper learning that comes from having time to make mistakes, to follow dead ends, to discover what genuinely interests us. Those seemingly inefficient processes are actually where the most important development happens.
As we wrap up, I want to return to that image we started with. 2 children, 2 approaches to time, both families deeply caring about their children's future. What would you want parents to understand about the long-term implications of these different approaches?
Time to explore and permission to own their work cultivates self-directed competence that outlasts any credential. The child who learns to navigate unstructured time, who develops the capacity for sustained attention on self-chosen projects, who experiences the satisfaction of following curiosity wherever it leads, that child is developing the fundamental skills of innovation and leadership.
And these aren't just nice-to-have qualities. In an economy that increasingly rewards creativity, problem-solving, and the ability to learn independently, these are the competencies that will determine who thrives and who simply survives.
Right. The future belongs to people who can teach themselves, who can identify opportunities that others miss, who can sustain attention on complex problems long enough to develop novel solutions. None of those capacities develop in heavily structured environments where children are always responding to external direction.
So the invisible advantage here isn't about having more resources or better opportunities. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful thing you can give a child is time. Unstructured, unoptimized time to discover who they are and what they're capable of creating.
Next time on The Invisible Advantage, we'll explore how wealthy families approach failure and resilience. Because once children develop this capacity for self-direction, they inevitably encounter setbacks and obstacles. How do different family cultures teach children to interpret and respond to those challenges? The patterns might surprise you.
Until then, remember that the goal isn't to fill time. It's to teach children to use time strategically. Thanks for listening to The Invisible Advantage. Welcome back to The Invisible Advantage, where we uncover the hidden patterns that shape opportunity and success. I'm Steven, and this is episode 5, where we're going to tackle something remarkable. Picture this scenario. 2 equally qualified candidates sit in the same job interview. One performs who they think the company wants to see: polished answers, safe responses, careful positioning. The other walks in and is genuinely themselves, sharing real opinions, asking challenging questions that might even make the interviewer uncomfortable. Both desperately want this job. So what allows one person to risk that kind of authenticity while the other plays it safe?
And I'm Edith. What you're describing, that willingness to be authentic even when stakes are high, that's the culmination of everything we've been exploring in this series. It's not just confidence, it's something deeper. It's the invisible advantage made visible. Today, we're synthesizing all the patterns we've uncovered: the psychological safety nets, the social capital, the ownership mindsets, and that strategic use of time we explored last episode. But more importantly, we're going to show how these advantages can be learned, practiced, and cultivated by anyone.
Because here's what's fascinating. We've been talking about the differences between wealthy and middle-class upbringings, but what we've really been mapping is a learnable system. Today, we're diving into 4 critical areas. First, how psychological safety creates the foundation for authentic self-expression. Second, how these 4 pillars we've identified work together as an integrated system. Third, how we can make these invisible patterns visible and teachable. And finally, how we can democratize what have traditionally been elite mindsets.
And why does this matter now? Because in our previous episode on time wealth, we saw how strategic use of time develops self-direction and deep competence. But time alone isn't enough. You need the psychological framework to use that time boldly, the social connections to amplify your efforts, and the ownership mindset to persist when things get difficult. These aren't separate advantages. They're components of a single, integrated approach to navigating the world.
So let's start with that foundation, psychological safety. When we say psychological safety creates authenticity, what exactly do we mean? Because I think most people hear safety net and think about money, but there's something much more nuanced happening here.
Think of it like this. Imagine you're walking across a bridge. If there's no railing and a 100-foot drop, you're going to move very carefully, probably staying right in the center, focused entirely on not falling. But if there's a solid railing, suddenly you can look around, appreciate the view, maybe even lean out a bit to get a better perspective. The bridge is the same, but the safety changes everything about how you move through the experience.
That's a perfect analogy. In the interview scenario, the candidate who plays it safe is walking that bridge without a railing. Their entire cognitive bandwidth is consumed by avoiding failure. Don't say the wrong thing. Don't ask the wrong question. Don't reveal anything that might be disqualifying. But the candidate who can be authentic has that psychological railing. They know that if this particular opportunity doesn't work out, they have other options, other connections, other ways forward.
And here's what's crucial to understand. This safety isn't just about having wealthy parents who can support you. It's about having internalized a set of beliefs. That failure is information, not identity. That relationships are more valuable than any single transaction. That there are always multiple paths to any goal. These beliefs create that psychological railing, and these beliefs can be learned.
Which brings us to how these advantages work together as a system. We've identified 4 pillars across our episodes: the safety net mentality, social capital and network thinking, ownership mindset, and strategic time use. But the real power isn't in any single pillar, it's in how they reinforce each other.
Exactly. Let me paint you a picture of how this works in practice. Take a child from a wealthy family who wants to start a small business. The safety net means they can take the risk of trying. Their social capital means they can get advice from adults who've started businesses, maybe even find their first customers through family connections. The ownership mindset means they view challenges as problems to solve rather than reasons to quit. And the time wealth means they can iterate and improve without the pressure of immediate success.
Now contrast that with a middle-class child with the same entrepreneurial dream. Without understanding these systems, they might have the same intelligence and work ethic, but they're operating with different assumptions. They might see failure as something to avoid rather than learn from. They might not know how to access mentorship or early customers. They might give up after the first setback because they don't have that ownership perspective.
But, and this is the crucial point, none of these advantages are actually about money. They're about mindset and learned behaviors. The wealthy child isn't inherently more capable. They've just been exposed to a different set of operating principles. And operating principles can be taught.
So how do we make these invisible patterns visible and teachable? Because that's really what this entire series has been building toward. We've been mapping the unwritten curriculum of privilege, but the goal isn't just understanding, it's application.
This is where it gets really interesting. Think about resource orchestration, how wealthy families think in ecosystems rather than individual actions. They don't just sign their kid up for tennis lessons. They think about how tennis connects to social networks, how it teaches persistence, how it might create college opportunities, how it builds a relationship with a coach who becomes a lifelong mentor. Every input is connected to multiple outputs.
That's systems thinking applied to personal development. And here's what's remarkable. Once you see this pattern, you can apply it regardless of your resources. A middle-class family might choose community theater instead of tennis, but they can think about it the same way. How does this build confidence? What adults will my child meet? What skills transfer to other areas? How can we maximize the social and developmental benefits?
And then there's optionality. Teaching children to create multiple pathways rather than betting everything on single outcomes. Wealthy families do this naturally. They don't just prepare their kids for one specific college or career path, they're constantly building options. Their children learn languages that might be useful, develop relationships across different industries, cultivate diverse skill sets.
But again, this isn't about having unlimited resources. It's about thinking in terms of portfolios rather than single bets. Any family can teach their children to develop multiple interests, to see connections between different areas, to build relationships in various contexts. The key is understanding that options themselves are a form of security.
Which leads us to what I call the reputation bank concept. Wealthy children learn early that credibility and trust are assets that compound over time. They see their parents maintaining relationships for decades, following through on commitments, even when it's inconvenient, building reputations for reliability and insight.
And this creates what we might call relationship capital, the accumulated goodwill and trust that makes future opportunities more likely. When someone has watched you handle small commitments well, they're willing to offer you bigger ones. When they've seen you be generous with your knowledge and connections, they're more likely to share theirs with you.
The beautiful thing is that building relationship capital doesn't require inherited connections. It requires consistency, authenticity, and a long-term perspective. These are learnable behaviors. You start small. Maybe it's always following through when you say you'll send someone an article, or consistently being someone who makes valuable introductions, or building a reputation for asking thoughtful questions.
Now, let's get practical, because understanding these patterns is one thing, but implementation is where the real transformation happens. What can families actually do, starting today, to begin cultivating these advantages?
This is where I get excited, because the actions are surprisingly accessible. Take something I call weekly family vision meetings. Wealthy families do this naturally. They're always discussing long-term goals, current projects, upcoming opportunities. But any family can institute 15 minutes each week where everyone shares what they're working toward and what experiments they want to try.
That's brilliant, because it normalizes long-term thinking and makes goal setting a family activity rather than an individual pressure. What about social capital development?
Introduction practice. Each family member, parents included, commits to making one valuable connection monthly, not networking for personal gain, but genuinely connecting people who should know each other. This teaches children that relationships are about creating value for others, and it naturally expands everyone's network in the process.
And for that ownership mindset we've discussed?
Failure celebration rituals. Once a month, every family member shares an intelligent failure, something they tried that didn't work and what they learned from it. This completely reframes failure from something shameful to something valuable. Children who grow up celebrating intelligent failures become adults who can take authentic risks.
I love that phrase, intelligent failures. It captures the idea that not all failures are equal. There's a difference between failing because you took a calculated risk and failing because you were careless or unprepared.
Exactly. And then there's option building as a habit. For every major goal anyone in the family sets, they have to develop 3 different pathways to achieve it. This prevents the all-or-nothing thinking that creates so much anxiety and limitation. If path 1 doesn't work, you have path 2 and path 3 ready to go.
What's fascinating is how these practices address the psychological underpinnings we've been discussing. The vision meetings create safety by making the future feel manageable and planned. The introduction practice builds social capital systematically. The failure celebrations develop ownership mindset by reframing setbacks. The option building creates the kind of strategic flexibility that wealthy children learn naturally.
And here's the thing, these aren't just practices for children. Parents who adopt these frameworks find their own opportunities expanding, because ultimately what we've been describing isn't just about childhood development, it's about a way of moving through the world that creates more possibilities and more resilience.
Which brings us to the deeper transformation happening here. We're not just talking about leveling the playing field, we're talking about moving from money-based advantages to mindset-based advantages. And mindset-based advantages are infinitely more democratic.
Think about what this means long-term. A generation of children growing up with these frameworks, regardless of their family's financial situation, will have access to the same psychological tools, the same relationship-building strategies, the same ownership mentality that previously only came with inherited privilege. They'll walk into that job interview we described at the beginning with the same authentic confidence.
Because they'll have learned that their value isn't determined by any single outcome, that failure is information rather than identity, that relationships are built through consistency and generosity, and that there are always multiple paths to any meaningful goal.
And perhaps most importantly, they'll understand that these advantages were never really about money to begin with. They were about wisdom. Wisdom about how relationships work, how opportunities are created, how resilience is built, how authentic confidence is developed. And wisdom, unlike inheritance, can be shared infinitely without being diminished.
So as we wrap up this series, I want to return to that interview scenario. The candidate who could risk authenticity wasn't necessarily born into wealth. They were someone who had learned these principles, practiced these behaviors, and internalized these beliefs. They had created their own invisible advantage.
Your background determined your starting point, not your destination. Every insight we've shared across these 5 episodes can be cultivated, taught, and practiced. The true invisible advantage is understanding that these patterns exist and choosing to adopt them consciously. The goal was never to replicate wealth, it was to replicate wisdom.
And that wisdom is now visible, teachable, and available to anyone willing to do the work of cultivation. Thank you for joining us on The Invisible Advantage. Until next time, remember, the most powerful advantages are the ones you create for yourself.
Because once you see the system, you can master the system. And once you master the system, you can teach it to others. That's how invisible advantages become visible possibilities for everyone.